The church bells of Pine Hollow rang out what should have been wedding chimes, but instead echoed like a funeral dirge. Abigail Ruth Yates stood abandoned at the altar in her grandmother's yellowed dress, watching her groom's dust cloud disappear beyond the chapel doors. 300 guests erupted in cruel laughter. The fat virgin bride jilted again. But as shame threatened to swallow her whole, a scarred stranger rose from the back pew. "She's mine now." Jasper Boon's voice cut through the mockery like thunder. "Back off. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels." The morning sun painted Pine Hollow in deceptive gold, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of St. Mary's Chapel. Inside, the pews groaned under the weight of 300 souls who had gathered not for celebration, but for spectacle. They came with hunger in their eyes, the kind that feeds on another's misfortune. Abigail Ruth Yates stood at the altar in her grandmother's wedding dress, the ivory silk now yellowed with age and stretched tight across her full figure. The dress had been beautiful once when Grandmother Yates had worn it 50 years prior. Now it served as a cruel reminder of dreams that seemed too large for the woman who dared to claim them. The chapel door hung open like a mouth gasping for air. Through it dust motes danced in the morning light, and beyond that the empty road stretched toward the mountains. Henry Porter should have been riding down that road by now, should have been dismounting his horse with flowers in his hand and promises on his lips. Instead, there was only silence. "Where is he?" whispered Mrs. Adelaide Finch from the third pew, her voice carrying the particular sharpness that only comes from years of disappointment. "Surely he wouldn't—" "Hush," her husband muttered, but his eyes gleamed with the same terrible anticipation. Abigail's hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet of wildflowers daisies, and black-eyed Susan she had picked herself that morning when hope still lived in her chest, like a small, bright bird. The petals were already wilting in the heat, their edges brown with premature death. Reverend Samuel Morrison cleared his throat from behind his pulpit, his weathered face creased with the particular expression ministers wear when they must deliver news that will break someone's heart. He had married half the couples in Pine Hollow over the past 30 years, had buried their children and blessed their harvests, but he had never faced a moment quite like this. "Perhaps," he began carefully, "we might wait a few more minutes." The sound of hoofbeats cut through his words like a knife through silk. Every head turned toward the open door, and for one brilliant moment Abigail's heart soared. Henry had come. He was late, but he had come, and all these doubters would see that someone could love her after all. But the rider who appeared in the doorway was not Henry Porter. Jake Mullins slid from his lathered horse, his face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He had ridden hard, and his mount's flanks heaved with exhaustion. In his hand he clutched a folded piece of paper that seemed to weigh more than the world. "Reverend," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the chapel like the toll of a death bell. "I got a message from Henry Porter." The silence that followed was so complete that Abigail could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She could hear the whisper of fabric as 300 people leaned forward in their seats. She could hear the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead and the creak of old wood settling in the heat. "Well?" Reverend Morrison's voice was gentle, but his eyes were already heavy with sympathy. Jake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "He ain't comin', Reverend. Says he just couldn't go through with it." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. She felt her knees buckle, felt the world tilt sideways, as if God himself had given it a mighty shove. The bouquet slipped from her nerveless fingers, scattering petals across the altar steps like fallen tears. Couldn't go through with what? The voice that spoke was her own, but it sounded strange and distant, as if it came from someone else entirely. Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Well, he said he just couldn't marry someone who looked like... He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The laughter started as a snicker from somewhere in the back pews. Then it spread like wildfire through dry grass, crackling and consuming everything in its path. Mrs. Finch covered her mouth with her gloved hand, but her shoulders shook with suppressed mirth. Old Tom Bradley slapped his knee and wheezed with amusement. Even the children began to giggle, feeding off the cruel energy that filled the chapel like poison gas. "The fat virgin bride," someone whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Jilted again," added another voice. "Who'd want her anyway?" The words came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of cruelty that seemed to rise from the very walls themselves. Abigail stood frozen at the altar, her face burning with shame so intense it felt like fever. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the earth itself, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Reverend Morrison raised his hands for silence, his face dark with righteous anger. "That's enough," he thundered. "This is God's house, and you will show some Christian charity, or you will remove yourselves from Christian charity." The voice came from the back of the chapel, cutting through the Reverend's words like a blade through butter. "Seems to me there's precious little of that in this place." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. In the very last pew, partially hidden in shadow, sat a man that most of Pine Hollow had heard of, but few had actually seen. Jasper Boon, the scarred hermit who lived alone in the mountains, who came to town maybe twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders and tall enough that his knees pressed against the pew in front of him. His face bore the evidence of some terrible accident or violence, a network of scars that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent slight grimace. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes, while clean, had seen better years. But his eyes burned with an intensity that made people look away. He stood slowly unfolding from the pew like a mountain rising from the earth. The laughter died in throats across the chapel as 300 pairs of eyes fixed on him. He had that effect on people, a presence that demanded attention even when he clearly preferred to remain unnoticed. "You all came here today," Jasper said, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent chapel, "expecting to see a wedding. Well, you're going to get one." He stepped into the aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor with each measured step. As he walked toward the altar, people instinctively leaned away from him as if his presence might be contagious. The scars on his face caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, making him look like some ancient warrior carved from stone. Abigail watched him approach with a mixture of confusion and terror. She had seen him before. Of course, everyone in Pine Hollow had caught glimpses of the mysterious mountain man when he came to town, but she had never been this close to him, had never looked directly into those fierce, dark eyes. He stopped at the foot of the altar steps and looked up at her. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. The abandoned bride and the scarred hermit, two outcasts, suddenly finding themselves at the center of the greatest drama Pine Hollow had seen in decades. "Miss Yates," Jasper said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle despite its gravelly tone. "If you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your husband." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have weight. Abigail felt as if she were drowning in it, as if the very air had turned to water and was filling her lungs. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "You can't be serious." Mrs. Finch finally sputtered from her pew. "You don't even know the girl." Jasper turned his scarred face toward her, and she shrank back as if slapped. "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know she's brave enough to stand here in front of all of you, even after what just happened. I know she's kind. I've seen her help old Mrs. Henderson with her groceries when she thought no one was looking, and I know she deserves better than what this town has given her." He turned back to Abigail, and his expression softened. The question is, Miss Yates, will you have me? I'm not much to look at. I know. I don't have fancy manners or a lot of money, but I can promise you this. I'll never leave you standing alone at an altar. I'll never let anyone laugh at you without answering to me, and I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of whatever trust you might place in me. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. This couldn't be happening. Men like Jasper Boon didn't propose to women like her. This had to be some kind of joke, some elaborate prank designed to add insult to the injury she had already suffered. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no mockery there. She saw something she had never seen directed at her before: respect. Not pity, not cruelty, not the awkward politeness that most people showed her. Simple, honest respect. She began, then stopped. Her voice was little more than a whisper. Why? Because Jasper said, taking a step closer to the altar, everyone deserves to be chosen. Everyone deserves to matter to someone. The tears came then hot and fast, streaming down Abigail's cheeks like rain on a drought-parched field. She had spent 32 years believing she was too much, too large, too plain, too eager, too desperate for love. She had accepted that she would live and die alone, that her dreams of marriage and children and belonging somewhere were foolish fantasies for a foolish woman. But here was this scarred stranger offering her something she had never thought possible: the chance to be wanted. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm sorry." Jasper cupped a hand to his ear. "I didn't quite catch that." Abigail straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. When she spoke again, her voice rang clear and strong through the chapel. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." The explosion of whispers and gasps from the congregation was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Finch clutched her chest as if she might faint. Tom Bradley's mouth hung open like a door left ajar. Even Reverend Morrison looked stunned, his prayer book hanging forgotten in his hands. But Jasper smiled, the first smile anyone in Pine Hollow had ever seen on his scarred face. It transformed him entirely, making the harsh lines of his features soften into something almost beautiful. "Well then," he said, mounting the altar steps with easy grace. "Reverend Morrison, I believe you have a ceremony to perform." The Reverend blinked several times as if trying to wake himself from a particularly vivid dream. That is, are you certain about this?" "Both of you. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Jasper said firmly. He held out his hand to Abigail, palm up, scarred fingers, steady and patient. Abigail stared at that offered hand for a long moment. Taking it would change everything. It would mean leaving behind the life she had known, the small, cramped existence of a spinster shopkeeper living above Hartwell's general store. It would mean trusting this man she barely knew, following him into an uncertain future. But staying meant remaining the object of Pine Hollow's pity and amusement. It meant spending the rest of her life as the fat virgin bride, the woman too pathetic to keep even Henry Porter. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and she felt something she had never experienced before: the sensation of being protected. Not because she was weak, but because she was precious to someone. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat and opened his prayer book with hands that shook slightly. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice gaining strength as he fell into the familiar rhythm of the ceremony. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Abigail like a benediction. She found herself studying Jasper's profile as the Reverend spoke, tracing the lines of his scars with her eyes. They told a story of pain and survival, of battles fought and somehow won. She wondered what had happened to him, what had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains. "Do you, Jasper Boon," Reverend Morrison was saying, "take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Jasper said without hesitation, his eyes never leaving Abigail's face. "And do you, Abigail Ruth Yates, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Abigail's voice caught in her throat. For better or worse. The words seemed to echo in the chapel, bouncing off the walls and settling into her bones. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Colorado," Reverend Morrison declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Jasper stepped closer, so close that Abigail could smell the clean scent of mountain air that clung to his clothes. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly, so only she could hear. The fact that he asked, that he cared about her comfort even in this moment, nearly undid her completely. She nodded, not trusting her voice. His kiss was soft and brief, more promise than passion, but it was hers. Her first kiss, given freely, without mockery or pity. When he pulled away, his smile was warm and real. "Mrs. Boon," he said, and the name sounded like music. The congregation erupted, then not in laughter this time, but in a chaos of shocked exclamations and frantic whispers. People craned their necks to get a better look at the newlyweds, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. But Abigail barely heard them. She was too busy marveling at the weight of the simple gold band Jasper had somehow produced for her finger. It was too large, clearly made for someone else, but it felt like the most precious thing she had ever owned. "Come on," Jasper said, offering her his arm. "Let's get out of here." They walked down the aisle together past the gaping faces and whispered speculation. Old Tom Bradley actually tipped his hat as they passed, though whether in respect or bewilderment, Abigail couldn't tell. Mrs. Finch looked like she had swallowed something particularly unpleasant. At the chapel door, Jasper stopped and turned back to face the congregation. His scarred face was set in hard lines, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warning that no one could mistake. "From this day forward," he said, his words cutting through the whispers, "like a sword, Abigail is under my protection. Anyone who thinks to treat her with anything less than the respect due to a married woman will answer to me. Are we clear?" The silence that greeted this announcement was answer enough. They stepped out into the afternoon sunlight together, and Abigail felt as if she were emerging from a cave after years of darkness. The world looked different, somehow brighter, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "My horse is tied up over there," Jasper said, nodding toward a magnificent black stallion that stood waiting patiently by the chapel fence. "But I suspect you might need a moment to gather your things." Reality crashed back over her like a cold wave. Her things, her life, everything she owned was in the tiny room above Hartwell's general store. She would need to collect her belongings, settle her accounts, say goodbye to the only home she had ever known. Yes, she said. "I have some things at the store. Mr. Hartwell will want to know that I'm leaving, and there are a few personal items." "Of course," Jasper said. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." They walked together down Main Street, past the blacksmith shop and the saloon, past the dry goods store and the barber shop. People came to windows and doorways to stare as they passed. Some looked curious, others shocked, a few openly disapproving, but no one laughed. Not with Jasper Boon walking beside her, his scarred face set in lines that promised retribution for any disrespect shown to his new wife. Hartwell's general store sat at the corner of Main and 2nd, its weathered sign creaking in the afternoon breeze. Abigail had worked there for nearly 10 years, ever since her parents died in the influenza outbreak that had swept through Pine Hollow like the angel of death. It had been her sanctuary and her prison, the place where she earned her meager living and watched life pass by through the front windows. Ezra Hartwell looked up from his ledger as they entered, his round face creasing with confusion when he saw Jasper beside her. Abigail, I thought you were getting married today. What's this fellow doing with you? Mr. Hartwell, Abigail said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I'd like you to meet my husband, Jasper Boon. The pencil fell from Ezra's fingers and clattered to the floor. Your husband? But what about Henry Porter? Henry Porter, Jasper said quietly, decided he had somewhere else to be. Ezra's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You mean he... At the altar in front of everyone? His face reddened with indignation. Why, that's unconscionable. The poor girl doesn't deserve... He trailed off as he became aware of Jasper's steady gaze fixed on him. Something in that scarred face suggested that pity, however well-intentioned, would not be welcome. What I mean to say, Ezra amended quickly, is that any man who would treat a fine woman like Abigail with such disrespect is no man at all. You're a lucky fellow, Mr. Boon. Yes, Jasper agreed simply. I am. Abigail felt a warm glow spread through her chest at his matter-of-fact agreement. No qualifications, no polite deflections, just simple acknowledgement that he considered himself fortunate to have married her. I'll need to collect my things, she told Ezra, and I'm afraid I won't be able to work here anymore. I'll be living up in the mountains now. Up in the mountains? Ezra's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. But Abigail, you've never even been camping. How will you manage in the wilderness? It was a fair question, and one that Abigail had been carefully not thinking about. She had spent her entire life in Pine Hollow, had never ventured more than a few miles from town. The idea of living in the mountains far from everything familiar was terrifying. But when she glanced at Jasper, she saw patience in his eyes, not judgment, not expectation, just patient confidence that she would figure things out. I'll learn, she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. They climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny room above the store, Jasper having to duck his head to avoid the low ceiling. Abigail felt a flush of embarrassment as she saw her modest quarters through his eyes, the narrow bed with its worn quilt, the single chair, the small table that served as both desk and dining surface. Everything she owned could probably fit in a single trunk, but Jasper showed no sign of judgment or surprise. He simply stood quietly while she gathered her few possessions, her mother's Bible, her father's watch, the small collection of books she had managed to acquire over the years, her few changes of clothing. This was my grandmother's, she said carefully, folding the wedding dress she had just taken off. It seemed wrong somehow to leave it behind, despite the painful memories it now carried. It's beautiful, Jasper said, and she could tell he meant it. You looked beautiful in it. The tears threatened again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had shed in the chapel. These were tears of gratitude, of wonder, at finding kindness in the most unexpected place. They made 3 trips to carry her belongings down to Jasper's horse. The stallion stood 17 hands if he was an inch coal-black with intelligent eyes and a spirit that matched his master's. He snorted softly when Abigail approached, but didn't shy away when she tentatively reached out to stroke his neck. His name is Thunder, Jasper said, securing her trunk behind the saddle with practiced efficiency. He's got more sense than most people and twice the loyalty. Thunder whickered as if in agreement, and despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling. He's magnificent. He'll learn to carry double, Jasper assured her. Until then, you can ride behind me. It's not the most comfortable way to travel, but it's not too far to my place. My place. The word sent a thrill of nervousness through her. In a matter of hours, she had gone from spinster shopkeeper to married woman, from town dweller to mountain wife. The magnitude of the change was almost too large to comprehend. Jasper mounted Thunder with easy grace, then reached down to help Abigail up behind him. She had ridden horses before, but never like this, never pressed against a man's broad back. Her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling the power of both horse and rider beneath her. Hold tight, Jasper said over his shoulder. Thunder's got a smooth gait, but the mountain trails can be tricky. They rode out of Pine Hollow as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Abigail looked back once to see the town spread below them, the place where she had been born and raised, loved, and laughed at, where she had spent 32 years, believing she would live and die unremarkable. But when she turned back around, the mountains rose before them like a promise. Somewhere up there in the thin air, an endless sky was her new life. Whatever it might bring, it would be hers, chosen freely, claimed boldly, lived on her own terms. As thunder carried them higher into the pine-scented wilderness, Abigail felt something she had never experienced before, the intoxicating rush of possibility. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, and for the first time in her life, that uncertainty felt like freedom. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, following a creek that tumbled down from the high country in a series of sparkling cascades. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, filled with the scent of mountain flowers and the distant promise of snow-capped peaks. Jasper rode with the easy confidence of a man who knew these trails like the lines on his own hand. He never hesitated at the countless forks and turns, never seemed uncertain of their direction. Behind him, Abigail gradually relaxed into the rhythm of Thunder's gait, her initial terror giving way to something approaching wonder. She had never seen the world from this perspective before, looking down at Pine Hollow from Eagle's Height, watching the valley spread out below them like a patchwork quilt. The town that had seemed so large and important in her daily life now looked tiny and insignificant, just another small collection of buildings dwarfed by the immensity of the mountain wilderness. "How much farther?" she asked, as the sun touched the peaks to the west, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Just over this next ridge," Jasper replied. "We'll be there before full dark." True to his word, they crested a final rise just as the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky. Below them, nestled in a natural bowl surrounded by towering pines, stood a log cabin that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. It was larger than Abigail had expected, not the rough hermit's shack she had imagined, but a solid, well-built structure with a stone chimney and what looked like several rooms. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows like liquid gold. "Home," Jasper said simply, and guided Thunder down the final slope toward their new beginning. Thunder's hooves crunched softly on the pine needles as they approached the cabin, and Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. The structure before them was nothing like what she had imagined during their long ride up the mountain. This wasn't the crude bachelor's hovel she had pictured in her mind. This was a real home. The logs were chinked tight against the mountain cold, and the roof looked solid and well-maintained. A wide porch wrapped around the front of the cabin with carved wooden posts that spoke of craftsmanship and care. Flower boxes hung beneath the windows, though they were empty now in the growing darkness. Even in the dim light, she could see that someone had taken pride in this place. "You built this yourself?" she asked as Jasper swung down from Thunder's back. "Mostly," he replied, reaching up to help her dismount. His hands were gentle but sure as they circled her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing at all. "Had some help with the roof and the stonework for the chimney. Mountain winters don't forgive sloppy construction." Abigail's feet touched the ground, but Jasper's hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. In that brief contact, she felt the warmth of his body through the fabric of her dress, and something fluttered in her chest that had nothing to do with nervousness. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. The cabin seemed to belong to the mountain landscape as naturally as the trees themselves, as if it had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Jasper's scarred face softened at her words. "I hoped you'd like it. I know it's not what you're used to, being so far from town and all." "It's perfect," Abigail interrupted, then felt her cheeks warm at her own boldness. But it was true, there was something about this place that called to a part of her she hadn't even known existed. Maybe it was the way the cabin nestled into the landscape without trying to dominate it, or maybe it was simply the fact that it was theirs, their home. Thunder nickered softly, reminding them of his presence, and Jasper chuckled. "Right, boy, let's get you settled for the night." He led the stallion toward a well-built stable that stood about 50 yards from the cabin, partially hidden among the trees. Abigail followed, marveling at how organized everything was. This wasn't the rough camp of a hermit. This was the carefully planned homestead of a man who intended to stay. The stable was as well constructed as the cabin, with 3 stalls and a tack room that smelled of leather oil and hay. "You have other horses?" she asked, noticing the empty stalls. "Had," Jasper said, his voice growing quiet as he unsaddled Thunder. "Lost my mare last winter to wolves. Been meaning to get another, but—" He shrugged, not finishing the sentence. But there hadn't been any point, Abigail realized. A hermit living alone had no need for multiple horses. The knowledge that he had been planning for solitude made his proposal to her that much more remarkable. He had literally changed the course of his entire life in the space of a single moment. They worked together in comfortable silence, Jasper handling Thunder's tack, while Abigail fetched fresh water and hay. She had helped in her father's small stable as a child, and the familiar tasks came back to her easily. When Thunder was settled for the night, munching contentedly on his feed, Jasper gathered her belongings and they walked back toward the cabin. The front door was made of heavy oak with wrought iron hinges that looked like they could last a century. Jasper paused with his hand on the latch, and for the first time since he had stood up in that chapel, he looked uncertain. "Abigail," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you're safe here. What happened today? I know it was fast, and I know you don't really know me. I don't expect anything from you except what you're willing to give. You'll have your own room, your own space. This marriage doesn't have to be. That is, we can take things as slow as you need." The thoughtfulness of his words made her throat tighten with emotion. In a world where women were often considered little more than property to be traded between men, here was this scarred stranger offering her choice, offering her dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." He nodded and opened the door, ushering her into warmth and golden lamplight. The interior of the cabin was even more surprising than the exterior. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Hand-hewn wooden furniture filled the space, a large table with matching chairs, a bookshelf lined with leather-bound volumes, even a rocking chair positioned near the hearth. Colorful rag rugs covered the plank floors, and kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows on the log walls. "Jasper," Abigail breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "This is incredible. You made all of this?" "Had a lot of time on my hands," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out I'm better with wood than I am with people." She walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spine of volumes that ranged from agricultural treatises to poetry collections. "You read Shakespeare. When the snow gets deep enough to trap a man inside for weeks at a time, you learn to appreciate good literature," Jasper replied. "Though I'll admit I prefer the comedies to the tragedies. Had enough of tragedy in my life." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. In the lamplight, the scars on his face seemed to tell their story more clearly, not just random marks of violence, but deliberate wounds that spoke of battles fought and barely survived. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, then immediately colored with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that's too personal. I had no right to—" "War," Jasper said simply. "Confederate cavalry saber at a little place in Tennessee most folks never heard of. Should have killed me, probably. Sometimes I thought it had." The pain in his voice was old but still sharp, like a blade that had been worn smooth by time but never dulled. Abigail felt an unexpected surge of protective anger toward whoever had hurt this gentle man. "I'm sorry," she said. "It must have been terrible." "It was a long time ago," Jasper replied, but his hand unconsciously moved to touch the scars along his jaw. I came up here afterward looking for some peace and quiet. Found more than I bargained for. He gestured toward a doorway at the far end of the main room. Your room is through there. I built it thinking, well, hoping someday I might have need of it. There's a bed and a dresser, and I put in a window that looks out toward the peaks. The view's particularly fine at sunrise. Abigail walked to the doorway and peered inside. The room was perfect, smaller than the main living area, but cozy and welcoming, with a quilt-covered bed and a washstand that held a blue ceramic pitcher and bowl. The promised window faced east, and she could imagine how beautiful the sunrise would be, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. It's wonderful, she said, then hesitated. But where will you sleep? I built a loft up there, Jasper said, pointing toward a ladder that led to what she had assumed was storage space. It's not fancy, but it suits me fine. She followed his gesture and realized that he had essentially built himself a bedroom in the rafters, leaving the main floor for his hoped-for family. The thoughtfulness of it, the careful planning for a future he couldn't have been certain would ever come, touched her deeply. You've thought of everything, she said. I tried to, Jasper replied. A man gets lonely up here, starts to dream about what it might be like to share it with someone. I just never imagined that someone would be... He trailed off, looking suddenly awkward. Would be what? Would be someone as fine as you, he finished quietly. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. No one had ever called her fine before. No one had ever looked at her the way Jasper was looking at her now, as if she were something precious and unexpected, a gift he hadn't dared hope for. I should let you get settled, Jasper said, stepping back from the doorway. It's been a long day, and tomorrow we'll need to talk about practical things. How you want to arrange the household, what you might need from town, that sort of thing. Abigail nodded, though part of her didn't want him to leave. The silence that would fill the cabin after he climbed to his loft felt suddenly daunting. Jasper, thank you for today, for all of this. I know you didn't have to. Yes, I did, he interrupted gently. The moment I saw you standing there, taking their mockery with such dignity, I knew I had to do something. You deserved better than what they were giving you. What if they're right? The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying all the fears and doubts that had plagued her for 32 years. What if I really am just a pathetic spinster who nobody could ever truly want? Jasper's expression grew fierce, and he crossed the room in 3 quick strides to stand directly in front of her. Don't you ever let me hear you say something like that again, he said, his voice low and intense. You are not pathetic, and you are not unwanted. Henry Porter is a fool who doesn't know treasure when it's handed to him. His loss is my gain. The conviction in his voice was so absolute that Abigail felt something shift inside her chest, like a locked door finally swinging open. For the first time in her life, she began to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she really was worthy of being loved. I'll try to remember that, she whispered. See that you do, Jasper said, his voice gentle again. Good night, Mrs. Boon. Mrs. Boon. The name still sounded like music, like a song she had never thought she would be allowed to sing. Good night, Jasper. She watched him climb the ladder to his loft, noting the easy strength in his movements despite his size. When he disappeared from view, she retreated to her own room and closed the door softly behind her. The space felt like a sanctuary. She lit the lamp on the washstand and began to unpack her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her books on the shelf beside the bed. Her mother's Bible went on the nightstand, along with her father's pocket watch, the only tangible connection she had left to her previous life. When everything was arranged to her satisfaction, she sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been Abigail Yates, spinster shopkeeper, resigned to a life of solitude and quiet desperation. Tonight she was Abigail Boon, married woman, mistress of a mountain homestead she could never have imagined. The change was so dramatic it felt like she had stepped through a doorway into someone else's life. Someone braver, someone worthy of protection and care, someone who could build a future in the wilderness with a scarred stranger who had offered her everything without asking for anything in return. Sleep was a long time coming that first night. Every sound was foreign, the whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the settling creaks of unfamiliar timber. But gradually, exhaustion won out over nervousness, and she drifted off to the sound of Jasper moving quietly in the loft above. She woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting from the main room. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the absence of the familiar morning sounds of Pine Hollow, the rattle of wagons on the main street, the voices of early shoppers, the distant whistle of the morning train. Instead, there was birdsong and the gentle rush of wind through pine boughs. There was the sound of someone moving efficiently around a kitchen, and underneath it all, the profound quiet of the wilderness. Reality crashed back over her like a wave. She was married. She was living in the mountains. She was supposed to be a wife now, though she had no idea how to go about it. She dressed quickly in her simplest work dress and emerged from her room to find Jasper standing at the stove, his back to her as he tended a skillet full of eggs. He had changed from his wedding clothes into practical work gear denim pants and a flannel shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he had been running his hands through it, and there was something endearingly domestic about the sight of this powerful man cooking breakfast. "Morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned with a smile that transformed his scarred features. "Morning, Mrs. Boon. I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," she admitted, "though it's certainly quieter than I'm used to." "It takes some getting used to," Jasper agreed, "but I've found there's peace in the quiet once you learn to listen to it properly." He dished eggs and bacon onto 2 plates, adding biscuits that looked golden and perfectly baked. "I wasn't sure what you like for breakfast, so I made a bit of everything." Abigail accepted the plate with wonder. It had been years since anyone had cooked for her. She had been taking care of herself since her parents died, grabbing quick meals between customers at the store. The simple act of being served breakfast felt like an unimaginable luxury. "This looks wonderful," she said, settling at the large wooden table. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Necessity," Jasper replied with a wry smile. "A man living alone either learns to cook or learns to be hungry. I chose cooking." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Abigail marveled at how natural it felt. She had expected awkwardness, uncertainty about how to behave around this man who was legally her husband, but remained essentially a stranger. Instead, she found herself relaxing into a rhythm that felt surprisingly right. "What do you do up here?" she asked eventually. "I mean for work." "I trap some," Jasper said. "Hunt when I need meat, but mostly I raise horses. Had a good business going before the war. Folks from all over the territory would come looking for my stock. I'm hoping to build that back up again." "Is that what happened to your other horses, the business?" Jasper's face darkened slightly. "Among other things, when I came back from the war, I found that certain people in town had decided my absence meant my property was available for redistribution. Lost most of my breeding stock to unpaid debts that somehow materialized while I was gone." The bitterness in his voice told Abigail there was more to that story, but she didn't press. Everyone had wounds that were too fresh to probe, and she suspected Jasper's ran deeper than most. "But you're starting over," she said instead. "Trying to," he agreed, "though it's not easy. People in Pine Hollow have long memories when it suits them, and convenient forgetfulness when it doesn't." Abigail thought about the whispers and stares that had followed them through town the day before. "They don't trust you. They don't trust anyone who doesn't fit their narrow idea of what a man should be," Jasper said. "Someone with scars, someone who prefers his own company to their gossip and small-mindedness that makes them nervous." She understood that feeling all too well. Her own experience with Pine Hollow's narrow-minded judgment had been the defining feature of her adult life. "What about you?" Jasper asked, changing the subject with obvious deliberation. "What would you like to do with your time up here? I know it's different from what you're used to." Abigail considered the question seriously. What did she want to do? For so many years, her time had been entirely consumed by work and survival. The idea that she might have choices, that her days could be shaped by her own desires rather than just necessity, was almost overwhelming. "I'd like to learn," she said finally, "about living up here, about the mountains, about you, if you will let me." Something shifted in Jasper's expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. They spent the morning with Jasper showing her around the homestead. The property was larger than she had realized, encompassing several acres of cleared land surrounded by dense forest. There was a vegetable garden that needed attention, a chicken coop that currently stood empty, and the foundation of what looked like it might become a barn someday. "I was planning to expand," Jasper explained as they walked the perimeter. "Build up the horse operation, maybe clear some more land for crops, but it's a lot of work for one person." "Well," Abigail said, surprising herself with her boldness, "you're not one person anymore." Jasper stopped walking and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No," he said slowly, "I'm not." They were standing near the edge of the cleared land where the forest pressed close with its cathedral of pines and aspens. The morning sun slanted through the trees, creating pools of golden light that danced and shifted with every breath of wind. It was beautiful beyond anything Abigail had ever experienced, but there was also something almost overwhelming about the vastness of it all. "Do you ever feel small up here?" she asked. "Insignificant, sometimes," Jasper admitted, "but not in a bad way, more like being reminded that there are things bigger than my own problems, bigger than what other people think of me." Abigail nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. After years of feeling crushed under the weight of Pine Hollow's judgment, there was something liberating about being in a place where human opinion seemed trivial compared to the ancient indifference of stone and sky. "Show me how to help," she said impulsively. "Help with what?" "All of it. The garden, the animals, the building. I don't know anything about mountain living, but I can learn. I want to be useful here, not just decorative." Jasper's scarred face broke into a grin that made him look years younger. "Decorative," he repeated with amusement. "I don't think anyone's ever accused you of being merely decorative, Abigail Boon." The way he said her married name made something warm uncurl in her chest. She was Abigail Boon now, not the pitied spinster, not the failed bride, but someone new, someone who might be capable of things she had never imagined. They spent the rest of the morning working in the neglected garden, pulling weeds and preparing the soil for late-season planting. Abigail's hands, soft from years of indoor work, quickly developed blisters, but she didn't complain. There was something satisfying about the physical labor, something deeply right about working the earth alongside this man who had chosen her when no one else would. As they worked, Jasper told her about the mountains, which plants were safe to eat, how to read the weather and the behavior of animals, where the deer came to drink in the early morning. His knowledge was encyclopedic, built from years of careful observation and hard-won experience. "You really do belong up here," Abigail said during a break, watching him identify edible berries with the casual expertise of someone who had made such knowledge a matter of survival. "It's the only place I've ever felt like I fit," Jasper admitted. "After the war, I tried to go back to my old life, but everything had changed. Or maybe I had changed and everything else had stayed the same. Either way, I couldn't find my place in it anymore." "What was your old life like?" Jasper was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were handling something fragile. "I had a farm down in the valley. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Had plans to expand it, maybe find a wife, start a family. All the usual dreams young men have." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. Funny how war has a way of showing you just how foolish those dreams really are. They weren't foolish, Abigail said firmly. Dreams of home and family, those are the most important dreams there are. Are they? Jasper looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. Even after everything that's happened to you, after the way people treated you? Abigail considered the question seriously.
Especially after that, she said finally. People who've never been hungry don't really appreciate food. People who've never been alone don't understand the value of belonging somewhere. And people who've never been unwanted, Jasper said quietly, don't know what a gift it is to be chosen. Their eyes met across the garden patch, and for a moment the air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. Abigail felt her heart speed up, felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. There was something building between them, fragile and new, but unmistakably real. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the trail. Jasper was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that leaned against the garden fence. His entire posture changed, becoming alert and defensive in the space of a heartbeat. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, his voice taking on the hard edge she had heard in the chapel. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses breathing hard from the climb. Abigail recognized 2 of them immediately, Sheriff Tom Bradley and Deputy Jake Mullins, the same Jake who had delivered Henry Porter's rejection the day before. The third man was a stranger, well-dressed in the manner of someone who spent more time in cities than on horseback. "Morning, Jasper," Sheriff Bradley called out as they approached, though his tone was anything but friendly. "Heard you got yourself married yesterday. Wanted to come up and offer our congratulations." The way he said it made it clear that congratulations were the furthest thing from his mind. Jasper didn't lower his rifle. "Tom, Jake, don't believe I know your friend." The well-dressed stranger urged his horse forward slightly. "Name's Carlton Hayes, Mr. Boon. I represent certain business interests that might be relevant to your situation here." "What kind of business interests?" Jasper's voice was flat dangerous. "The kind that pay well for cooperation," Hayes replied smoothly, "and pay even better for property rights in strategically important locations." Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had heard enough conversations in Hartwell's store to recognize the language of men who took what they wanted and called it business. "My property's not for sale," Jasper said simply. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Boon," Hayes replied with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "It's just a matter of finding the right price." I said no. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and even Deputy Mullins looked like he wished he was anywhere else. Hayes, however, seemed unperturbed. "Perhaps you should reconsider. A man with a new wife might want to think about her safety. These mountains can be dangerous places for folks who don't know how to navigate the various hazards." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jasper's grip on his rifle tightened, and Abigail saw the scar along his jaw pull taut as his face hardened into something that belonged on a battlefield. "Mr. Hayes," Jasper said, his voice so quiet it was barely audible, "I suggest you get off my land. Now." "Now, Jasper," Sheriff Bradley interjected, though he sounded nervous. "No need to get hostile. Mr. Hayes is just trying to have a civilized conversation." "Civilized conversation doesn't involve threatening a man's wife," Jasper replied without taking his eyes off Hayes. "You've got 30 seconds to turn those horses around and head back down the mountain. After that, I'm going to assume you're trespassing with hostile intent." Hayes studied Jasper's face for a long moment, taking in the scars and the absolute lack of backing down in those dark eyes. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him that Jasper wasn't bluffing. "This isn't over, Mr. Boon," Hayes said as he wheeled his horse around. "I always get what I want one way or another." "We'll see about that," Jasper replied evenly. The 3 men rode off, but their departure felt more like a strategic retreat than a defeat. Abigail watched until they disappeared into the trees, her heart hammering with a combination of fear and admiration.
She had never seen anyone stand up to authority figures the way Jasper just had never imagined that someone might choose to protect her rather than sacrifice her for the sake of peace. "What did they want?" she asked, when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. "My land," Jasper said grimly, finally lowering his rifle. "And probably yours too, now that you're my wife." "Mine, but I don't own any land." "You do now," Jasper said. "Marriage laws in this territory give wives equal claim to their husband's property, which means you just became half-owner of one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate in these mountains." The implications of that hit her like a physical blow. She had gone from being a nobody with nothing to being someone with something worth fighting for. The transformation was dizzying. "What makes this land so valuable?" she asked. "Water," Jasper said simply. "And the railroad route they're planning through the valley. My property sits right where they'd need to put a depot and switching station. Without it, their whole plan falls apart." "Can they force us to sell?" Jasper's expression grew even grimmer. "They can try. Men like Hayes have ways of making life difficult for people who don't cooperate. But I've been through worse than anything they can dish out, and I'll be damned if I let them take what's mine." "What's mine?" The word sent a thrill through Abigail that was equal parts fear and excitement. For the first time in her life, she was part of something worth defending. She was someone worth protecting. "What do we do?" she asked. "We be careful," Jasper said. "We watch our backs, and we make sure we're ready for whatever they try next." As they walked back toward the cabin, Abigail felt the weight of her new reality settling around her like a cloak. She had married Jasper, seeking escape from humiliation and solitude. She hadn't expected to find herself in the middle of a fight for their very survival. But as she looked at the determined set of her husband's shoulders, at the way he held himself ready for whatever challenges might come, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in her 32 years, Abigail Boon was exactly where she belonged. The threat that hung in the mountain air, like smoke from a distant fire, became reality 3 weeks later. Abigail woke to the acrid smell of burning wood and Jasper's urgent voice cutting through her dreams. "Abigail, get up, the barn's on fire." She bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs as orange light flickered through her bedroom window. In those terrible first moments of consciousness, she could hear the roar of flames and the terrified whinnying of thunder from the stable. By the time she threw on her clothes and stumbled outside, Jasper was already running toward the blazing structure with a bucket in each hand. The barn they had been planning, the foundation and frame he had spent years preparing, was engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. "The well," Jasper shouted over the crackling roar. "We need water." Abigail ran for the hand pump, her bare feet slipping on the dew-wet grass. Her hands shook as she worked the handle, sending precious water splashing into bucket after bucket. But even as they fought the fire with desperate determination, she could see it was hopeless. The flames had too much of a head start, had consumed too much dry timber to be stopped by their meager efforts. Thunder's cries grew more frantic from the stable, and Jasper made the split-second decision that revealed everything about his character. "The horse," he said, grimly dropping his bucket. "I have to get Thunder out before the fire spreads." "Jasper, no." Abigail grabbed his arm as he started toward the stable. "It's too dangerous." "I'm not losing him," Jasper said with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "That horse saved my life more times than I can count during the war. I won't abandon him now." He pulled free from her grip and ran toward the stable, disappearing into the smoke-hazed darkness. Abigail continued pumping water with tears streaming down her face, not from the smoke, but from the terrible certainty that she was about to lose the husband she had only just found. The minutes stretched like hours before Jasper emerged from the stable, leading a wild-eyed Thunder into the clear air. Both man and horse were coughing and singed but alive. Relief flooded through Abigail so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. They spent the rest of the night watching their dreams burn. By dawn, nothing remained of the barn but a blackened skeleton of support beams and a pile of ash that still sent wisps of smoke curling into the morning sky. The smell of destruction hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of how quickly everything could change. "This wasn't an accident," Jasper said quietly as they surveyed the damage in the gray light of early morning. His face was streaked with soot, and his hands were blistered from fighting the flames, but his voice was steady. "You can see where they poured accelerant along the foundation. This was deliberate." Abigail stared at the charred remain of their hopes, feeling something hard and cold settle in her chest. Haze. Has to be. This is how men like him operate. They make their threats politely, then follow through with violence when politeness doesn't work. The cabin had been spared, but only because the wind had been blowing away from it. If the breeze had shifted even slightly, they might have lost everything. The thought made Abigail sick, with a combination of rage and fear. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jasper was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the smoldering ruins. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard decisions. "We rebuild," he said simply, "and we make sure they know that burning us out won't work." "But what if they try again? What if next time they come for the cabin, or—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that they might come for Jasper himself. "Then we'll be ready for them," Jasper said, turning to face her. The scars on his face seemed more pronounced in the morning light, telling their story of survival against impossible odds. "I didn't come through a war just to be driven off my own land by cowards who hide behind money and hired thugs." The steel in his voice reminded Abigail that this gentle man who cooked her breakfast and showed her which berries were safe to eat was also a veteran who had faced down Confederate cavalry and lived to tell about it. There was something both comforting and terrifying about that knowledge. They spent the morning assessing the damage and planning their response. The loss of the barn was devastating not just financially, but emotionally. It represented months of work and years of dreams reduced to ash in a single night of malice. But as they worked together to clear the debris, Abigail began to understand something fundamental about her husband. Jasper Boon was not a man who broke easily. Every setback seemed only to strengthen his resolve, every challenge to clarify his purpose. "We'll build it back better," he said as they stacked salvageable timber. "Bigger, stronger, stone foundation this time so it won't burn as easy." "With what money?" Abigail asked, practically. "Building materials cost. I've got some savings," Jasper interrupted. "And there's timber on the property. It'll take longer doing it ourselves, but we can manage." The quiet confidence in his voice made her believe him. This man had carved a life out of raw wilderness, with nothing but determination and skill. Rebuilding a barn, even under threat, was just another challenge to overcome. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jasper immediately tensed his hand, moving toward the rifle that now lived within easy reach wherever they worked. But the riders who emerged from the tree line weren't the well-dressed threats they had been expecting. Instead, a small group of what looked like Native Americans approached on painted ponies their leader, a young woman with intelligent dark eyes and traditional clothing that marked her as Ute. She rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, and her companions, two older men with weathered faces, flanked her with the watchful alertness of experienced warriors. "Easy," the woman called out in accented English as Jasper raised his rifle. "We come in peace. We saw the smoke last night, came to see if you needed help." Jasper didn't lower his weapon, but he didn't aim it either. "Who are you?" "I am Nita," the woman replied, sliding gracefully from her pony. "These are my uncles, Joseph and Samuel. We live in the valley where our people have always lived." "The Ute Reservation is 20 miles south of here," Jasper said carefully. Nita's expression grew bitter. The reservation is where white men say we must live. But our people have been in this valley since before your grandfather's grandfathers were born. Some of us remember the old ways, the old claims." She gestured toward the burned ruins of the barn. "This is the work of the railroad men, yes, the ones who would drive out anyone who stands in their way." Abigail felt Jasper's surprise echo her own. They had assumed their conflict with Hayes was an isolated matter, but apparently the reach of railroad ambition extended further than they had realized. "You know about Hayes?" Abigail asked. "We know about all of them," Nita replied. "They came to our elders last month with papers and promises, said they needed our land for the greater good, that they would compensate us fairly for our sacrifice." One of the older men spoke rapidly, in what Abigail assumed was Ute, his tone clearly agitated. Nita nodded grimly and translated. "My Uncle Joseph says they offered us money for land that was never theirs to buy, then threatened to take it anyway when our council refused to sell." "They threatened you too." Jasper finally lowered his rifle, though he remained alert. "Not threatened," Nita corrected, "promised. They said they would remove us one way or another. They have soldiers coming, they claim, with authority from Washington to relocate any Indians who interfere with railroad progress." The casual way she spoke of such a monstrous injustice made Abigail's blood boil. "That's not right. They can't just force people from their homes because it's convenient." Nita's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You are new to this country, I think. White men have been taking land from Indians for as long as there have been white men. They call it manifest destiny and sleep well at night." "Not all white men," Jasper said quietly. "No," Nita agreed, studying his scarred face with interest. "Not all. That is why we came to you, enemy of our enemy, as they say." "What are you proposing?" Jasper asked. "Information," Nita replied. "We know things about the railroad plans that you do not, and you know things about their tactics that might help us prepare." She gestured toward the burned barn. "They started with you because your land is crucial to their route, but they will not stop with you. They mean to clear this entire valley of anyone who might oppose them." Jasper and Abigail exchanged glances. The idea of allying with the local Ute tribe would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, but circumstances had a way of creating unexpected partnerships. "What kind of information?" Jasper asked. Nita smiled for the first time since arriving, and it transformed her stern features into something almost beautiful. "The kind that might save both our peoples, if we are brave enough to use it." She reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a rolled document yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "This is a treaty signed 30 years ago between our tribe and the territorial government. It guarantees our people permanent rights to the hunting and fishing grounds in this valley." Jasper accepted the document and carefully unrolled it, his eyes scanning the formal language. "If this is legitimate, it means the railroad has no legal authority to remove us," Nita finished, "and no right to build through our traditional lands without tribal consent." "Which you would never give," Abigail said. "Which we would never give," Nita confirmed. "But Hayes and his people are counting on no one knowing about old treaties buried in government files. They think they can simply declare our rights void and proceed with their plans." Jasper rolled the treaty back up carefully. "This could change everything, if we could get this to the right authorities." "The right authorities are the ones who want the railroad built," Nita pointed out. "They will find ways to declare the treaty invalid or claim it was superseded by newer agreements." "Then what good does it do us?" Abigail asked. "It gives us legitimacy," Jasper said, understanding dawning in his voice. "We're not just squatters resisting progress, we're allies of a sovereign people defending their legal rights." "More than that," Nita added, "it gives us time. Legal challenges take months, sometimes years, to resolve, long enough for public opinion to turn against the railroad's methods." The plan that began to form over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than fighting Hayes and his allies in isolation, They would create a coalition of resistance that crossed racial and cultural lines. The Ute would share their legal documentation and knowledge of the land, while Jasper would use his war experience to organize defensive strategies. "It won't be easy," Nita warned as they discussed the details. "Hayes has money and political connections. He can hire soldiers, bribe officials, make life very difficult for anyone who opposes him." "Let him try," Jasper said grimly. "I've fought better men than Carlton Hayes with less cause and fewer resources." As the Ute riders prepared to leave, Nita approached Abigail directly. "You are not what I expected," she said quietly. "What did you expect?" Abigail asked. "Another soft town woman who would run at the first sign of trouble," Nita replied honestly. "But you stayed to fight the fire. You stand beside your husband instead of behind him. Maybe there is strength in you that even you do not know yet." The words stayed with Abigail long after the riders had disappeared back into the forest. Strength she didn't know she had. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. That afternoon brought another visitor, this one far less welcome. Henry Porter rode up the mountain trail on a borrowed horse, his city clothes already dusty from the journey. He looked nervous and out of place in the wilderness setting, like a man who had never been far from paved streets and gaslighting. "Abigail," he called out as he dismounted awkwardly. "I need to talk to you." Jasper emerged from the cabin before Abigail could respond, his rifle once again in his hands. "Porter, what do you want?" "I want to speak to Abigail," Henry stammered, clearly intimidated by Jasper's intimidating presence. "Privately, if possible." "Nothing you have to say to my wife needs to be said privately," Jasper replied evenly. "Speak your piece or get off my land." Henry's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Now see here, Boon, I have a prior claim on Abigail's affections. We were engaged to be married before this irregular arrangement." "We were never engaged," Abigail said firmly, stepping up beside Jasper. "You ran away from our wedding, remember? That tends to dissolve any understanding between people." "I made a mistake," Henry said desperately. "I was nervous, confused, the pressure of the moment. Surely you can understand that." "What I understand," Abigail replied, "is that when things got difficult, you chose to abandon me rather than stand by me. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Henry's expression grew calculating. "This mountain hermit can't give you the life you deserve, Abigail. A proper home in town, social standing, security." "Security?" Jasper's voice was dangerously quiet, like the security of being abandoned at the altar in front of 300 people. "That was different." "No," Jasper interrupted. "That was exactly what it was. You showed everyone exactly what kind of man you are when you ran instead of keeping your word." Henry's desperation became more apparent as he realized his appeal to Abigail was failing. "There are things you don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Pressures, obligations. Important people in this territory have plans that your presence here complicates." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Abigail felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "Important people like Carlton Hayes?" she asked. Henry's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Jasper said grimly. "Hayes got to you, didn't he? Convinced you that marrying Abigail would interfere with his railroad plans, maybe offered you money or threatened consequences if you went through with the wedding." That's ridiculous," Henry protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Abigail asked, pieces of hurt and humiliation crystallizing into cold anger. "Did he pay you to abandon me, Henry? Was embarrassing me in front of the entire town, worth whatever he offered?" "It wasn't like that," Henry said weakly. "He just explained how important the railroad was for the territory's future, how certain property arrangements needed to remain fluid." "Property arrangements," Abigail repeated. "You mean my potential inheritance rights to Jasper's land?" Henry's silence was answer enough. "Get out," Jasper said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded soldiers in battle. "Get out now before I forget that you're not worth the ammunition it would take to shoot you." "Abigail, please." Henry made one last desperate attempt. "You don't belong in this wilderness. Come back to town with me. We can still—" "I am exactly where I belong," Abigail said with a certainty that surprised even her. "With a man who chose me when it mattered, not one who sold me out for railroad money." Henry mounted his borrowed horse with wounded dignity. "You'll regret this, Abigail. When winter comes and you're trapped up here with a scarred hermit, when the loneliness and hardship become too much to bear, you'll remember that you had another choice." "The only thing I regret," Abigail replied, "is that I ever thought you were worth my time." She watched him ride away with a strange sense of closure. For years she had carried the secret shame of her failed courtship. With Henry had wondered what she might have done differently to keep his interest. Now she understood that there had never been anything she could have done because Henry Porter had never been hers to lose. He had been bought and paid for before their courtship had even begun. "Are you all right?" Jasper asked gently as they watched Henry's dust cloud disappear down the mountain. "I'm better than all right," Abigail said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I stand." That evening, as they sat before the fire planning their next moves, Abigail found herself studying her husband's profile in the flickering light. The scars that had once seemed so intimidating now told a story of survival and strength. The hands that could handle a rifle with deadly efficiency were equally gentle when they touched her face or helped her down from Thunder's back. "Jasper," she said softly, "why did you really marry me?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were handling something precious and fragile. "Because when I looked at you standing there in that chapel taking their mockery with such dignity, I saw myself," he said. "I saw someone who had been judged by appearances, dismissed because of things they couldn't control. I saw someone who deserved better than what the world was giving them." And now, Jasper turned to face her fully, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Now I think I was wrong." Abigail's heart clenched. "Wrong. I didn't marry you because you deserved better," Jasper said quietly. "I married you because I was selfish enough to want something beautiful in my life. Something worth protecting, worth fighting for." The words hit her like a physical blow, but not one that hurt. Instead, they filled spaces inside her that she hadn't even realized were empty. "I've never been called beautiful before," she whispered. "Then you've been surrounded by blind men," Jasper replied with absolute conviction. "Beauty isn't about meeting some arbitrary standard set by people who don't matter. It's about character, courage, the willingness to stand up when everything in you wants to fall down." He reached out and touched her face with fingers that were rough from work, but infinitely gentle. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever known, Abigail Boon. And if it takes the rest of my life to prove that to you, then I'll consider it time well spent." The kiss that followed was different from their brief wedding kiss in the chapel. This one carried the weight of shared danger, mutual respect, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. When they finally broke apart, Abigail felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "we face it together." "Together," Jasper agreed. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant promise of winter. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were planning their next move. But for this moment, in the warmth of their cabin, with the fire casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Abigail Boon felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The storm that had been building since Carlton Hayes first rode up their mountain was about to break in earnest. But they would weather it as they had weathered everything else, side by side, with courage, born of necessity and love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of their resolve. But tonight they were simply husband and wife, united in purpose and growing closer with each shared adversity. The mountains that surrounded their small cabin held their peace for now, but Abigail could feel change coming in the wind. When it arrived, she would be ready. The change Abigail had sensed in the wind arrived with the force of a summer thunderstorm, sudden and devastating. It came not as she expected, with more burned buildings or midnight threats, but with news that shattered what little peace they had managed to build. Nita rode up their mountain trail 3 days after Henry's humiliating visit, her pony lathered with sweat and her face grim with urgency. She didn't dismount, didn't offer the usual polite greetings. Instead, she spoke words that hit like physical blows. "They took Joseph and Samuel," she said without preamble. "Soldiers came in the night. They said my uncles were troublemakers, threats to territorial security." Jasper dropped the axe he had been using to split firewood. His scarred face hardening into the mask Abigail had learned meant he was preparing for war. When, 2 nights ago, they're being held in the territorial prison in Denver, charged with inciting rebellion against lawful government authority. Nita's voice was steady, but Abigail could see the rage burning in her dark eyes. Hayes has powerful friends, it seems. The implications crashed over Abigail like an avalanche. If Hayes could arrange the arrest of respected tribal elders on trumped-up charges, what could he do to a scarred hermit and his unwanted wife? "What about the treaty?" Abigail asked. "Surely that proves the treaty disappeared from tribal council chambers the same night my uncles were taken." Nita replied bitterly. "Very convenient timing." Jasper began pacing his mind, already working through strategies and contingencies. "They're moving faster than we expected, taking out the tribal leadership, eliminating the legal challenges. It gets worse," Nita said. "I have word from friends in town. Hayes has convinced the territorial governor that this valley harbors dangerous insurgents. Federal troops are coming, real soldiers, not just hired guns." The words hit Abigail like a punch to the stomach. Federal troops. The full weight of government authority turned against them for the crime of refusing to surrender their homes. "How long do we have?" Jasper asked. "Days, maybe a week," Nita replied. "They're organizing a full expedition, soldiers, surveyors, railroad engineers. They mean to sweep through this valley and clear out anyone who stands in their way." Abigail felt the walls of their new life closing in around them. Everything they had built, everything they had hoped for, threatened to crumble under the weight of forces far beyond their ability to resist. "We could run," she said quietly. "Leave before they arrive, start over somewhere else." Both Jasper and Nita looked at her with expressions of surprise and disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism. "Run where?" Jasper asked gently. "How long before Hayes's railroad reaches there too? How long before some other powerful man decides he wants what we've built?" "Besides," Nita added, "my people have been running for generations. Always one more valley, one more reservation, one more promise that this time will be different. Running never solves anything. It just postpones the inevitable." Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Then what do you suggest? We can't fight the United States Army with hunting rifles and good intentions." "No," Jasper agreed. "But we can make them understand the cost of what they're doing. We can make sure the world knows that Hayes and his cronies are using federal troops to steal land for private profit." "How?" Abigail demanded. "Who's going to listen to a mountain hermit and a handful of Indians?" "More people than you might think," Nita said thoughtfully. "There are newspapers in Denver, politicians who oppose railroad monopolies, church groups who still believe in justice for Indian peoples. And there are settlers in this valley who've been getting the same kind of pressure we have," Jasper added. "Farmers who've been told their land is needed for the greater good, ranchers who've had their cattle mysteriously disappear after refusing to sell." An idea began to form in Abigail's mind, audacious and terrifying in equal measure. What if we brought them all together, not to fight the soldiers, but to stand with us when they arrive? A public confrontation, Jasper said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Make it impossible for Hayes to operate in secret. More than that, Abigail said, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. Make it a choice between shooting down unarmed families or admitting that this whole expedition is about railroad profits, not territorial security. Nita's eyes gleamed with something that might have been admiration. You would risk everything on the hope that federal soldiers won't fire on women and children. I'd risk everything on the belief that most men, even soldiers following orders, still have consciences, Abigail replied, and on the knowledge that newspapers love stories about government corruption. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was ambitious beyond anything Abigail had ever imagined herself capable of. They would send word to every family in the valley, every settler who had received Hayes's threats, every tribal member still living on their traditional lands. When the federal expedition arrived, they would find not isolated holdouts to arrest quietly, but a united community standing together in defense of their homes. It's dangerous, Jasper warned as they finalized the details. If this goes wrong, if the soldiers decide to use force anyway, people could die. People are going to die anyway, Nita pointed out grimly. My uncles are old men. They won't survive long in a territorial prison. And how many other families will be destroyed if Hayes gets his way? Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong, Abigail said, with a conviction that surprised even her. We make sure the world is watching when those soldiers arrive. The next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Nita rode to every Ute camp within 100 miles, carrying word of the planned gathering and the need for witnesses. Jasper visited isolated homesteads and struggling farms, speaking quietly with men and women who had thought they were alone in their resistance to railroad pressure. Abigail found herself taking on a role she had never imagined, organizer-leader, the voice that convinced frightened families to risk everything for a principle. She discovered that her years of listening to customer complaints and mediating disputes in Hartwell's store had taught her skills she hadn't known she possessed. Mrs. Chen is worried about her children, she told Jasper after visiting the Chinese family who ran a small market garden in the lower valley. She says they've already faced enough persecution without adding federal soldiers to the mix. What did you tell her? Jasper asked. That her children will face worse persecution if Hayes succeeds, Abigail replied. That sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to stand up and fight for it. And she's coming, they're all coming. By the 4th day, their cabin had become the unofficial headquarters of what people were already calling the Pine Hollow Resistance. The irony wasn't lost on Abigail that the woman who had been mocked as the fat virgin bride was now coordinating the most significant challenge to territorial authority in Colorado's history. The morning of the 5th day brought the sound they had all been dreading, the measured cadence of marching feet and the jingle of military harness echoing up from the valley floor. The federal expedition had arrived. Abigail stood on their porch beside Jasper, watching through his spyglass as the blue uniformed column wound its way up the mountain trail. There were perhaps 50 soldiers led by a young captain whose brass buttons gleamed in the morning sun. Behind them came the civilians Hayes and his railroad engineers, territorial officials in dark suits, even a photographer with his bulky camera equipment. They're not expecting trouble, Jasper observed, handing her the spyglass. Look at their formation. It's a parade march, not a combat advance. Abigail studied the approaching force through the lens, noting the casual way the soldiers carried their rifles and the relaxed posture of their officers. They think this is going to be easy. Let's make sure they're wrong. The gathering point they had chosen was a natural amphitheater in the mountains, a bowl-shaped clearing surrounded by pine-covered slopes that provided excellent acoustics and multiple escape routes. By the time the federal column reached the site, nearly 300 people had assembled, more than Abigail had dared hope for. There were homesteading families with their children, grizzled prospectors who had spent decades in these mountains, Ute warriors in traditional dress standing beside their wives and elders. There were Chinese immigrants and Mexican vaqueros, German farmers and Irish railroad workers who had quit their jobs rather than participate in Hayes's scheme. Most importantly, there were witnesses. Nita had somehow managed to convince reporters from 3 different Denver newspapers to make the journey along with a territorial judge who had ridden up from Colorado Springs and a minister from the Methodist Church who had brought his entire congregation. "My God," Jasper breathed as they surveyed the crowd. "Look what you've done." "Look what we've done," Abigail corrected, but she felt a surge of pride at the sight. These people had come because they believed in something larger than themselves, something worth defending against impossible odds. The federal captain, a young man named Morrison, who looked barely old enough to shave, rode into the clearing with obvious confusion. This wasn't what he had been told to expect. Instead of a handful of dangerous insurgents, he found what looked like a church picnic with military implications. Captain Morrison dismounted and approached the crowd with visible uncertainty. Behind him, Carlton Hayes was already speaking urgently with the territorial officials, his face red with anger at this unexpected development. "I am Captain James Morrison of the 4th Colorado Infantry," the young officer announced in a voice that carried across the clearing. "I have orders to arrest certain individuals suspected of inciting rebellion against territorial authority." An elderly Ute chief named Grey Wolf stepped forward, his weathered face dignified despite the ridiculous nature of the charges. "I am Grey Wolf of the Ute Nation. Which of us do you wish to arrest, Captain?" Morrison consulted a paper in his hand, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Joseph Running Bear and Samuel Longknife for conspiracy against the territorial government. Joseph Running Bear and Samuel Longknife are in Denver already arrested on false charges," Grey Wolf replied calmly. "Would you like to arrest me instead? Or perhaps this grandmother?" He gestured toward an ancient Ute woman who was weaving baskets with arthritic hands. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, and Morrison's face reddened. This wasn't going according to plan. "Furthermore," Grey Wolf continued, "I would like to present this document to your attention." He produced a copy of the treaty that Nita had somehow managed to preserve, holding it high enough for everyone to see. "This is a legal agreement between the Ute Nation and the territorial government, signed 30 years ago, guaranteeing our people permanent rights to these lands." One of the newspaper reporters immediately stepped forward, notebook in hand. "Captain Morrison, can you comment on allegations that this military action is being used to violate existing treaty obligations?" Morrison looked around desperately for guidance, but the territorial officials were huddled in heated conversation with Hayes, leaving the young captain to face the growing media attention alone. That is, my orders are to arrest specific individuals suspected of what exactly?" The voice that cut through Morrison's stammering belonged to Abigail, and she stepped forward with a confidence that amazed even her. "Captain Morrison, I am Abigail Boon, and this is my husband Jasper. We own property in this valley, property that certain railroad interests would like to acquire for private development." She gestured toward Hayes, whose face had gone purple with rage. "That man has threatened us, burned our barn, and apparently convinced your superiors that defending our legal property rights makes us dangerous insurgents. I'd like to know what law we've broken by refusing to sell our land to a private corporation." The reporter was scribbling frantically in his notebook, and his photographer was already setting up his camera equipment. Morrison looked like a man who wished he was anywhere else on earth. "Ma'am, I don't know anything about land disputes or railroad companies," Morrison said desperately. "I have orders to arrest specific individuals, Orders based on false information provided by men who stand to profit from our removal, Jasper said, stepping up beside his wife. His scarred face was calm, but his voice carried the authority of a man who had once commanded soldiers himself. Captain, I served in the war between the states. I know something about following orders, and I know something about being asked to do dishonorable things in the name of duty. Morrison's eyes widened as he took in Jasper's scars and the unmistakable bearing of a combat veteran. You served 3rd Colorado Volunteers, Jasper replied. Gettysburg, Antietam, half a dozen other places I'd rather forget. I took orders from men who told me I was fighting for freedom and justice. What are your officers telling you, Captain? The young officer's face was a study in conflicted emotions. They said we were putting down a dangerous rebellion, protecting law-abiding citizens from hostile Indians and criminal elements. Look around you, Abigail said gently. Do these people look like dangerous rebels to you? Morrison's gaze swept across the crowd, families with children, elderly couples holding hands, ministers and teachers, and farmers who had worked this land for decades. Whatever he had been expecting to find, this wasn't it. There are children here, he said slowly, as if just realizing the implications. Our children, said Mrs. Chen, stepping forward, with her 3 young ones clinging to her skirts. Children who will have nowhere to go if these men steal our homes. And our grandchildren, added an elderly German farmer named Klaus Brennan, his accent thick but his words clear. Children who deserve to inherit the land their families have worked and bled for. Hayes had apparently had enough of watching his carefully planned operation dissolve into a public relations disaster. He pushed through the crowd of officials and strode toward Morrison with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Captain Morrison, he barked, you have your orders. I don't care how many people these troublemakers have recruited. Your job is to arrest the ringleaders and disperse this unlawful assembly. Actually, said a new voice from the edge of the clearing, I'd be very interested to hear the legal basis for that assertion. Everyone turned to see Territorial Judge William Harper approaching on horseback, his black robes marking his authority even in the wilderness setting. Harper was a small, precise man with steel-gray hair and the kind of reputation that made lawyers nervous and politicians careful. Your Honor, Hayes said, his tone shifting immediately to something approaching respect. I wasn't aware you were. That is, this is a military matter. Any matter involving the rights of territorial citizens is a judicial matter, Mr. Hayes, Judge Harper replied calmly as he dismounted, particularly when those citizens are being threatened with arrest for exercising their constitutional rights. He approached Captain Morrison with the kind of authority that comes from decades of making life and death decisions. Captain, I'd like to see your orders, please. Morrison handed over his papers with obvious relief. Someone else could make the hard decisions for a change. Judge Harper read the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he finished, he looked up at Morrison with something approaching pity. Captain, you've been used. These orders are based on allegations that have no legal foundation. Worse, they appear to be part of a scheme to use federal troops for the private benefit of railroad interests. Hayes stepped forward aggressively. Now see here, Harper. The territorial governor himself authorized. The territorial governor, Judge Harper interrupted coldly, does not have the authority to suspend constitutional protections for the convenience of private corporations. Even if he did, which he does not, these people have committed no crime that would justify military intervention. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Citizens of Colorado Territory, you have the absolute right to refuse to sell your property to private interests. You have the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. You have the right to assemble peacefully and speak your minds on matters of public concern. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Harper raised his hand for silence. However, you also have the obligation to respect lawful authority and to seek redress through legal channels. He turned back to Morrison. Captain, I'm ordering you to stand down. No arrests will be made today, and this assembly will be allowed to continue peacefully." "Sir," Morrison said with obvious relief, "I'm happy to comply with your orders, but I'll need to report this to my commanding officer." "You do that," Harper replied, "and you can tell Colonel Martinez that I'll be filing a formal complaint about the misuse of federal troops for private gain." Hayes looked like a man watching his life's work crumble before his eyes. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I have political connections you can't imagine. I'll have your appointment reviewed, Harper." "Mr. Hayes," the judge replied with icy calm, "I suggest you worry more about your own legal situation. Using false information to manipulate federal troops is a federal crime. Threatening public officials is another one. I'd recommend you consult with an attorney before you say anything else that might incriminate you further." The crowd was buzzing with excitement, now sensing that the tide had turned decisively in their favor. The newspaper reporters were interviewing everyone they could reach, and the photographer was capturing images that would appear in papers across the territory. But Abigail found herself focused on a different sight. Captain Morrison and his soldiers, looking relieved and slightly ashamed as they prepared to march back down the mountain. These were good men who had been asked to do something dishonorable, and she felt sorry for them. "Captain Morrison," she called out, approaching the young officer. "Thank you." "For what, ma'am?" Morrison asked, genuinely confused. "For being the kind of man who could see the truth when it was presented to you," Abigail replied. "For choosing what was right over what was easy." Morrison's face reddened, but not with anger this time. "I'm sorry about your barn, ma'am, and I'm sorry we were sent here under false pretenses." "The barn can be rebuilt," Abigail said. "What matters is that you and your men showed that federal soldiers still have honor." As the military column prepared to depart, Hayes made one last desperate attempt to salvage his scheme. He approached several of the territorial officials, speaking urgently and gesturing toward the crowd. "What's he doing?" Jasper asked, appearing at Abigail's side. "Trying to find another angle," she replied. "Men like Hayes don't give up easily." They were right to be concerned. Even as the immediate crisis passed, Abigail could see Hayes's mind working, calculating new strategies, identifying new pressure points. This battle was won, but the war was far from over. Judge Harper seemed to understand this as well. As the crowd began to disperse, he approached Abigail and Jasper with a serious expression. "This was well done," he said quietly, "but Hayes is right about one thing: he does have powerful political connections. This setback will only make him more determined, more creative in his methods." "What do you suggest?" Jasper asked. "Document everything," Harper replied. "Every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every suspicious fire or accident. Build a legal case that can't be ignored or dismissed." He turned to Abigail with something approaching respect. "Mrs. Boon, you've shown remarkable leadership today. These people listened to you, trusted you. That's a rare gift and a dangerous one in the wrong circumstances." "What do you mean?" Abigail asked. "I mean Hayes now sees you as his primary obstacle," Harper said bluntly. "He'll come after you, specifically try to discredit you, or worse. You need to be very careful." As the judge rode away and the last of the crowd dispersed, Abigail found herself alone with Jasper in the clearing that had witnessed their unlikely victory. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched her emotional state, triumph tinged with uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring. "We did it," Jasper said quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I still can't quite believe it, but we actually did it." "We stopped them today," Abigail corrected. "But Judge Harper is right. Hayes won't give up this easily." "Then we'll be ready for him," Jasper replied with quiet confidence. "Today proved something important, Abigail. We're not alone in this fight. We have allies, people who believe in what we're doing." Abigail leaned back against her husband's solid warmth, drawing strength from his presence. "When I woke up this morning, I was terrified. Terrified of the soldiers, terrified of failing all those people who were counting on us. And now I'm still terrified, she admitted with a laugh, but it's a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being helpless, but the fear of having more responsibility than I ever imagined possible. You're not the same woman who was abandoned at that altar, Jasper observed. That woman would never have faced down federal troops and won. Abigail turned in his arms to look at his scarred face, illuminated by the dying light. Neither of us is the same as we were then. That's what love does, isn't it? It changes you into someone braver than you thought you could be. The kiss they shared in that mountain clearing tasted of victory and promise of two people who had found in each other the courage to fight for something larger than themselves. When they finally broke apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Come on, Jasper said, taking her hand. Let's go home. Home. The word carried new weight now, encompassing not just their cabin in the pines, but the entire community they had helped to create. A community of people who had chosen to stand together against injustice, who had proven that ordinary citizens could still make their voices heard in a world increasingly dominated by corporate power. As they walked hand in hand through the twilight forest, Abigail reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a pitied spinster with no prospects and no hope. Tonight, she was a leader, a symbol of resistance, a woman who had found her voice and used it to change the world. The transformation was so complete it seemed almost impossible. But then she thought with a smile the best transformations usually did. The transformation that had begun with a single moment of courage in St. Mary's Chapel found its completion 6 months later on a snow-covered mountain that sparkled like diamonds under the winter sun. Abigail stood at the window of their rebuilt cabin watching the final preparations for what the newspapers had taken to calling the Pine Hollow Unity Feast, a celebration that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The cabin itself bore witness to how much had changed. What had once been Jasper's solitary retreat was now the heart of a thriving community network. The main room had been expanded to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came seeking advice, offering support, or simply wanting to be part of something larger than themselves. The walls were lined with letters from supporters across the territory maps, showing the locations of Allied settlements and copies of the newspaper articles that had made Abigail's name known from Denver to San Francisco. The last of the Denver delegation just arrived. Jasper called from the front porch, stamping snow from his boots as he entered. His breath misted in the cold air, but his eyes shone with satisfaction. Judge Harper brought his whole family, and that reporter from the Rocky Mountain News is setting up his camera equipment. Abigail turned from the window, marveling at how natural her husband looked in his role as community organizer. The man who had once sought solitude in these mountains now coordinated with tribal councils, territorial officials, and newspaper editors with the same easy competence he had once applied to surviving alone in the wilderness. "How many are we expecting now?" she asked, though she had lost count days ago. "Near as I can figure, close to 500, Jasper replied with a grin that transformed his scarred features. "Folks have been arriving all week from as far away as Utah Territory. Even got a delegation from the Navajo down south who heard about what we accomplished here." The scope of their success still amazed Abigail. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save their individual homesteads had grown into a territorial movement that challenged the very foundations of corporate land grabbing. The legal precedents established by their resistance had been cited in court cases across the West, and the publicity surrounding their victory had made Carlton Hayes's name synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. "Any word on Hayes himself?" Abigail asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jasper's expression darkened slightly. "Last I heard, he was holed up in his Denver mansion, fighting federal corruption charges and trying to keep his railroad investors from abandoning ship. Turns out using military troops for private gain doesn't sit well with Congress, especially when the newspapers get hold of the story. The downfall of Carlton Hayes had been swift and spectacular. Within weeks of the confrontation in the mountain clearing, federal investigators had uncovered a web of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The governor who had authorized the military expedition had resigned in disgrace, and several railroad executives faced criminal charges. But Abigail knew that men like Hayes didn't simply disappear when their schemes failed. They regrouped, found new allies, waited for public attention to move elsewhere before striking again. "He's still dangerous," she said quietly. "Maybe," Jasper agreed. "But he's not the same kind of threat he was before. We've built something here that's bigger than any one man's ambition. Even if Hayes found a way to come after us again, he'd be facing an entire movement, not just a handful of isolated homesteaders." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Abigail opened it to find Nita standing on their porch, her arms full of what looked like ceremonial regalia. The young Ute woman had become not just an ally, but a genuine friend over the past months, her intelligence and fierce loyalty making her invaluable to their growing coalition. "The elders want to present you with something special tonight," Nita said without preamble, her breath visible in the cold air, "a honor that hasn't been given to a white woman in living memory." She unfolded the bundle she carried, revealing a magnificent shawl woven in traditional Ute patterns, but incorporating symbols and colors that told a new story, one of cooperation between peoples who had once been enemies. "It's called the Courage Shawl," Nita explained, holding it up so they could see the intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon light. "Our women have been working on it for months, ever since the day you stood up to those soldiers. Each bead represents a prayer for wisdom and strength." Abigail reached out to touch the soft wool, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. "I don't deserve something this beautiful." "You deserve it more than anyone," Nita replied firmly. "You could have run when things got dangerous. You could have taken the easy path and left us to fight alone. Instead, you chose to stand with us, even when it meant risking everything you cared about." "We all stood together," Abigail protested. "Yes, but someone had to be the first to stand," Nita pointed out. "Someone had to show the rest of us that it was possible to fight back and win. That someone was you." As afternoon faded into evening, people began gathering in the natural amphitheater where their confrontation with the federal troops had taken place. What had once been a site of conflict had been transformed into something resembling an outdoor cathedral, with pine boughs and winter flowers creating a festive atmosphere despite the snow. The diversity of the crowd would have been unthinkable in most parts of the territory. Ute families sat beside German immigrants. Chinese merchants shared food with Irish railroad workers, and Mexican vaqueros compared notes with Scandinavian farmers. Children who spoke different languages played together in the snow while their parents planned cooperative ventures that would have been impossible under the old system of suspicion and segregation. "Look what we've built," Jasper said softly as they surveyed the gathering from their position at the edge of the clearing. "A year ago, half these people wouldn't have spoken to the other half. Now they're planning to start a cooperative grain mill together." Abigail felt a surge of pride mixed with profound humility. This wasn't her achievement alone, it belonged to every person who had chosen courage over safety, cooperation over isolation. But she couldn't deny the role she had played in making it possible. Judge Harper approached them as they mingled with the crowd, his formal demeanor relaxed in the festive atmosphere. "Mrs. Boon, I wanted you to know that the territorial legislature has formally adopted the Pine Hollow Accords as the basis for new settlement law. Your principles of community cooperation and indigenous rights are now legal precedent throughout Colorado Territory." The Pine Hollow Accords had been drafted during a series of meetings throughout the fall, bringing together representatives from dozens of communities to establish new frameworks for land use and conflict resolution. They weren't perfect, no human institution ever was, but they represented a genuine attempt to create something better than the winner-take-all mentality that had dominated the frontier. "What does that mean practically?" Abigail asked. "It means that what you've accomplished here will be protected by law," Harper replied. "No railroad company or land speculator can use the tactics Hayes employed. Communities have legal standing to resist forced displacement, and tribal treaty rights are formally recognized as binding agreements." "And Hayes himself?" Jasper asked. Harper's expression grew grim. "Hayes won't be troubling anyone for a long time. The federal prosecutors have enough evidence to put him away for decades, assuming he doesn't flee the country first." As darkness fell and the ceremonial fires were lit, the real purpose of the evening began to unfold. This wasn't just a celebration of their victory over Hayes. It was a recognition of how profoundly all their lives had changed. Grey Wolf, the elderly Ute chief, who had faced down Captain Morrison with such dignity, rose to address the gathering. His voice carried clearly through the cold night air, speaking first in his native language before switching to English for the benefit of the diverse audience. "6 moons ago, we stood in this place facing soldiers who came to drive us from our homes," he began. "We stood as separate peoples, Ute and white farmer and herder, new settler and old inhabitant. Tonight we stand as one people bound together by shared struggle and shared victory." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Abigail felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she listened to words that captured something she had felt but never been able to articulate. "But this victory belongs most especially to one among us." Grey Wolf continued, his ancient eyes finding Abigail in the crowd. "To the woman who taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear. To the one who showed us that the heart of a warrior can beat in the breast of any person who chooses to stand for what is right." The crowd parted as Nita approached carrying the courage shawl with ceremonial solemnity. The firelight played across the intricate beadwork, making it seem to glow with inner light. "Abigail Boon," Grey Wolf said formally, "the women of the Ute Nation have woven for you this symbol of our respect and gratitude. Wear it knowing that you carry with you the prayers and blessings of a people who will never forget what you have done." As Nita draped the shawl across Abigail's shoulders, the weight of it seemed to settle into her bones, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. The woman who had once believed herself too fat, too plain, too insignificant to matter, now stood before hundreds of people who saw her as a symbol of hope and transformation. "I don't have words," Abigail said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I would live and die as nothing more than an object of pity and ridicule." She paused, looking out at faces illuminated by firelight, faces that had become as familiar as family over the months of struggle and triumph. "You've taught me that no one is too small to make a difference," she continued. "You've shown me that when people choose to stand together, there's no force on earth that can defeat them. Most importantly, you've given me something I never thought I would have: a place where I belong, a purpose worth fighting for, and the knowledge that my life matters." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of fires and the distant call of a winter owl. Then Jasper stepped forward, his scarred face proud and tender as he looked at his wife. "When I married this woman," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I thought I was rescuing her from a life of loneliness and shame. I was wrong. She rescued me from a life of bitterness and isolation. She taught me that healing doesn't come from hiding from the world. It comes from finding something worth fighting for and people worth standing beside." He reached out and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of true partnership. "Abigail Boon is the greatest blessing of my life," Jasper continued. "But she's also become something more than that. She's become the heart of a movement that will outlast all of us. The voice that showed a territory full of frightened, isolated people that they could choose to be something better. The applause that erupted from the crowd was thunderous, echoing off the surrounding peaks and sending night birds wheeling into the star-filled sky. But Abigail barely heard it. She was lost in the wonder of this moment, this life that had grown from the ashes of her deepest humiliation. As the formal ceremonies gave way to music and dancing, she found herself pulled into conversations with people whose lives had been touched by their struggle. There was Mrs. Chen, whose market garden now supplied produce to 3 counties through the cooperative network they had established. There was Klaus Brennan, whose grandchildren played freely with Ute and Mexican children, learning that the world was larger and more wonderful than any single culture could contain. "You know what the best part is?" asked Sarah Martinez, a young woman whose family had joined their coalition after being threatened by railroad agents near Pueblo. "My daughter will grow up thinking this is normal, thinking that people of different backgrounds working together is just how things are supposed to be." The truth of that observation hit Abigail with unexpected force. They weren't just changing their own lives, they were creating a different world for the children who would inherit it. A world where the old patterns of suspicion and exploitation would seem as strange and outdated as the worst excesses of the feudal past. Near midnight, as the celebration began to wind down and families with small children started the journey back to their homes, Abigail found herself alone with Jasper beside one of the dying fires. The courage shawl was warm around her shoulders, but it was the weight of his arm around her waist that made her feel truly secure. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Henry hadn't run away that day?" she asked quietly. Jasper considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but not with regret, more like wondering about a path that was never really meant to be taken." "What do you mean?" "I mean Henry Porter was never going to be the man who could love you the way you deserved to be loved," Jasper replied. "Even if he hadn't been bought off by Hayes, even if he had gone through with the wedding, he would never have seen in you what I see. He would never have recognized the strength and courage that were always there waiting for the right moment to emerge." Abigail leaned against his solid warmth, marveling at how completely her understanding of herself had changed. "I was so angry with him for so long, angry and hurt and ashamed. And now I'm grateful," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "If Henry had married me, I would have spent my life trying to be small enough to fit his narrow idea of what a wife should be. I never would have discovered what I was actually capable of." "Fate has a way of putting people where they need to be," Jasper observed, "even when the path there leads through heartbreak and humiliation." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the embers paint shifting patterns of light and shadow on the snow. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and patient witnesses to this small human drama that had somehow become something larger than the sum of its parts. "What comes next?" Abigail asked eventually. "Next, we've won this fight, established the legal precedents, built the coalition. But movements don't just stop, they either grow or they fade away. What do we do to make sure this one grows?" Jasper smiled at the question, recognizing the restless energy that had driven her from abandoned bride to territorial leader. "I suppose we keep doing what we've been doing, showing people that there's another way to live. Proving that cooperation works better than competition, that diversity makes communities stronger rather than weaker. The Denver newspapers want me to come speak at some kind of women's conference next month," Abigail mentioned. "They think what we've accomplished here might inspire similar movements in other territories." "Will you go?" Abigail considered the invitation that still sat unanswered on their kitchen table. The idea of leaving their mountain sanctuary, even temporarily, felt daunting, but she was beginning to understand that the principles they had fought for were too important to keep hidden in one remote valley. "I think I have to," she said finally. "Not because I want to be famous or important, but because there are probably women in Denver and San Francisco and God knows where else who feel as trapped and powerless as I used to feel. If our story can show them that change is possible, then you'll go," Jasper said with quiet pride. and I'll go with you if you'll have me." The thought of facing the wider world together, of carrying their message beyond the familiar confines of their mountain community, was both thrilling and terrifying. But then Abigail reflected the most important things usually were. As the last of the celebration wound down and the final guests began their journeys home, Abigail found herself thinking about the woman she had been just 1 year ago. That woman had believed herself unworthy of love, incapable of courage, destined for a life of quiet desperation and unfulfilled dreams. Tonight, wrapped in a shawl that represented the respect of an entire people, she understood that transformation was always possible. It didn't require perfect circumstances or special gifts. It only required the willingness to stand up when standing up mattered, to speak truth, when silence seemed safer, to choose love over fear, even when the odds seemed impossible. The snow continued to fall as they walked home through the forest, each flake catching the moonlight like a tiny star. Their cabin waited, warm and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney in a straight line toward the clear night sky. It was the same cabin where Jasper had lived alone for so many years, but it had become something entirely different, a symbol of hope, a gathering place for dreamers and fighters, a home built not just with logs and stone, but with courage and determination and love. "Mrs. Boon," Jasper said, as they reached their front porch, using the formal address that had become a private joke between them. "Yes, Mr. Boon," she replied, playing along with the game that never failed to make her smile. "Thank you." "For what?" "For proving that the best things in life are worth waiting for," he said, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted of snow and starlight and infinite possibility. "For showing me that some stories don't end with, and they lived happily ever after, they end with, and this was just the beginning." As they stood together on the threshold of their home, Abigail knew that he was right. This wasn't an ending. It was a transformation so complete that the woman she had been and the woman she had become seemed like different people entirely. The fat virgin bride who had been abandoned at the altar had become a leader, a symbol, a force for change in a world that desperately needed changing. More importantly, she had become herself, fully, completely, unapologetically herself. And that she realized was the greatest victory of all. The mountains held their peace around the small cabin where two unlikely lovers had found something worth fighting for. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the snow-covered peaks, their voices echoing with wild joy. It was the sound of freedom, of wildness, of lives lived without apology or compromise. It was the sound of home,